55 days ago, Lynette Hooker vanished from a tiny dinghy in the dead of night, heading back to the boat she called home, the Soulmate. Or so her husband claims. But as we speak, the Coast Guard has seized that vessel, towed it to Florida, and cordoned it off with crime scene tape. And let's be clear about one thing. Federal agents do not take those steps for a simple accident. They do it when they believe the vessel holds secrets the sole survivor refuses to share. Today, we are investigating exactly what those agents were hunting for, and why one tiny piece of evidence on that boat might prove more valuable than any living witness. Here is where the investigation stands right now, because things are moving incredibly fast, and they are not shifting in Brian Hooker's favor. For weeks, this played out as a tragic accident, a couple chasing their dreams on the open ocean, a rough night, a sudden fall, and a body lost to the deep. That was the official narrative, but then the physical evidence began to speak, and the story fell apart.
Startling new leads have escalated a missing person search into a full-scale criminal probe, putting their sailboat in federal custody and sending search divers back underwater. We are talking about hard data that directly refutes the sole survivor's account. In this investigation, that is exactly why the new evidence is reshaping everything.
No rumors, no wild theories, just a clear timeline we can trace step by step. So, let's examine it. We have to start with the vessel itself, understanding its history to truly grasp its current state. The Soulmate was no weekend cruiser. For nearly 3 years, it served as the couple's entire world. Brian and Lynette, married for about 25 years and hailing from Michigan, had fully committed to a retirement path that most of us only ever dream of. They took to the Atlantic aboard her back in 2023, living aboard full-time while sailing along the coast of the United States and through the Caribbean. They documented their entire journey for a small but dedicated online audience under their brand, The Sailing Hookers. Consider what that means for a second. A couple putting their daily lives online leaves a permanent trail behind them.
Dates, locations, the ordinary digital breadcrumbs left by two people who never imagined someone would eventually verify their story against a ticking clock. Yet today, that vessel sits stripped of its warmth on a concrete dock, combed through by gloved investigators. The home where they felt safest is being systematically dismantled by federal agents.
Before examining what those agents were searching for, we have to look at why this case captured the attention of the entire nation in the first place. An American citizen disappearing from a boat in beautiful tropical waters, a husband returning completely alone, no body, and a story full of massive holes. That haunting combination has not gripped the public mind like this since Natalie Holloway vanished in Aruba back in 2005. It pulled in everyone, from the true crime communities of the internet all the way to the national evening news.
And that intense interest matters, because every single step the investigators take now happens under a harsh spotlight.
The moment they cordoned off that sailboat with crime scene tape, it made national headlines. People are following this case closely, but the real question is what they are about to see. Let's return to the night it all began, the evening of April 4th. Around 7:30 in the evening, Brian and Lynette departed Hopetown, a small settlement located on Elbow Cay. They boarded their 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy to cross the Sea of Abaco, making their way back to the Soulmate, which lay anchored out in the dark. Visualize the local geography, because in this investigation, geography serves as the central argument.
Elbow Cay is a narrow island famous for its iconic candy-striped lighthouse. The waters between the shore and the anchored sailboat can shift from calm glass to violent currents in an instant.
Lynette was last spotted near Aunt Pat's Bay. Somewhere during that brief crossing, according to Brian, his wife went over the side of the small dinghy and vanished into the darkness. This is the official account he gave to authorities. Listen closely, because nearly every contradiction in this investigation is buried right here. Brian claimed to the police that Lynette fell overboard while clutching the engine's safety key in her hand. That key is attached to a lanyard, often called a kill cord, and the very second it is pulled free, the motor shuts down. Because she went overboard with the key, he claims the engine died instantly and refused to restart. He says the strong currents quickly swept her away into the blackness, and he lost visual contact. Left completely powerless, he claims he spent hours paddling the dinghy, eventually washing ashore miles away from where he began. He finally stumbled into the Marsh Harbor boatyard around 4 in the morning, alerting a bystander who immediately contacted the authorities. Now pause and analyze that story for a moment. It raises the exact question investigators asked right away. Who wears the kill cord? The boat's operator. That is the entire purpose of the safety device, to cut power if the driver is thrown clear. If the dinghy was moving, why did Lynette have the key and not the man operating the vessel? Lynette's family voiced that precise concern very early in the investigation. While that detail alone proves nothing, it is the exact kind of loose thread that, once noticed, cannot be ignored. And then there is the timeline. Roughly 8 hours passed from the moment Brian says his wife fell overboard to the moment her disappearance was actually reported. 8 hours. To the husband, that gap represents a brutal ordeal. The stalled engine, the struggle against the sea, the exhausting paddle to safety. But to a seasoned investigator, 8 hours is an eternity of unaccounted-for time. Where was that dinghy during those silent hours? Why was no distress call made sooner? You do not need to assume foul play to see why that delay alarmed investigators. It left a critical question wide open, one that remains unanswered. And look closely at where he claims his journey ended. Brian did not attempt to return to the soulmate, which sat anchored nearby in familiar territory. Instead, he claims he drifted and paddled to the Marsh Harbor boatyard, a completely separate location in the commercial center of the Abacos, finally arriving around 4 in the morning. So look at the geography the detectives had to untangle. A woman goes overboard in the vicinity of Elbow Cay. The sailboat is sitting right there, anchored. Yet her husband, drifting in a powerless dinghy, somehow floats the opposite way for hours. He finally washes ashore at a boatyard, far from where she vanished, and far from the home they shared. Maybe the ocean currents really did pull him that way. The sea plays cruel tricks in the dark.
But every single mile of that path is something investigators must test against the wind, the tides, and raw physics. And the more closely you trace his route, the more the questions begin to pile up.
It doesn't help that friends painted a messy, complicated picture of their life on the water. One friend called them dangerously inexperienced for the waters they sailed, adding that their small dinghy was never equipped to handle the rough weather that night. That is not an accusation. The ocean claims the skilled and the reckless alike, but it frames this mystery. 2 souls, 1 fragile boat, vast black water, and a night crossing attempted in conditions he himself admitted were rough. That is precisely the kind of backdrop where a tragic accident is entirely believable. But it is also a stage where, with no body and no other witness, darker possibilities begin to crowd in. To be clear, the initial search and rescue effort was massive, exactly what you would hope for. By the very next afternoon, a massive search effort was sweeping across both land and sea. Bahamian authorities, local dive teams, and the United States Coast Guard all joined the hunt. According to one of Brian's friends, investigators even took him back to the spot where he claimed Lynette went overboard. They searched together for hours before leaving him back on his sailboat, where he stayed alone for a day. 3 days later, the life preserver he claimed to have thrown her washed ashore, but Lynette was nowhere to be found, and suddenly the entire investigation shifted. On April 8th, only 4 days after she vanished, Bahamian police placed Brian Hooker in handcuffs and began interrogating him. They kept him locked up for 5 days. Under local laws, they were fighting a ticking clock.
Police could only hold him for so long without filing formal charges. On April 13th, time finally ran out, and they had to let him walk completely free.
His lawyer has maintained his innocence from day one, and Brian insists he had absolutely nothing to do with this and just wants his wife back. But even as he walked out,
The Bahamian police commissioner made one detail very clear. Brian was still their prime suspect.
He did not leave that station because he was innocent. He left because they simply did not have the physical evidence to charge him yet. A search operation had silently transformed into a murder investigation, and the husband was right in the crosshairs. Soon, details about their marriage started to paint a very dark picture. Lynette's own daughter, Carly Aylesworth, told NBC News that her mother and Brian had a history of fighting, especially after drinking.
That claim did not stand alone.
A Michigan police report from 2015 showed Lynette had been arrested for domestic assault. The couple blamed each other, but prosecutors ultimately dropped the case because they couldn't prove who started the physical fight. Of course, none of this proves what actually happened out on the ocean that night, and we shouldn't pretend it does. But it changes the entire context. A highly volatile relationship paints a very different picture for a fatal accident than a happy, peaceful marriage, and detectives analyzed his story through that exact lens. So, where is Brian Hooker today? The truth is, nobody is willing to say on the record. Once set free, he fled the Bahamas, returning to America to care for his sick mother. That was according to his lawyer, Terrell Butler, who has since stopped answering questions as the criminal investigation continues to move forward. Brian has completely vanished from the public eye, but what he did next, according to CBS News, shocked everyone. He released detailed maps showing the dinghy's precise path and the exact location where his wife went into the ocean. Let that sink in. A suspect in an active case didn't just give a statement, he drew it. He literally mapped out his story, and as we will see, it might be the biggest mistake he ever made. To be fair, Brian's public story has never wavered, and we must look at his claims as closely as the suspicions. During the days after Lynette vanished, he wrote online about his grief, calling it a tragic boating accident in rough seas and heavy winds. He claimed the brutal conditions ripped them apart despite his best efforts, and that locating her was his only goal. Later, speaking directly to NBC News, he made his message clear. He never hurt Lynette, he never would, and his only hope is to find her. I have never harmed Lynette, and I never would harm Lynette, and I want to find her. Those are his exact words, and he is fully entitled to the presumption of innocence. The problem isn't that he remained silent. The real issue is that the more detailed his story becomes, the easier it is for cold hard facts to tear it apart. Meanwhile, her family has been left entirely in the dark. Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, says police rarely contact her, and she has not spoken to Brian since that night. Her daughter, Carly, now speaks for the family in public, marking each painful milestone as they pass. The first Mother's Day without her mom, and the realization that she will never get another text message. But Carly also shared a specific detail that still haunts everyone following this case. She revealed that Brian left a voicemail claiming he had thrown a life preserver to her mother right after she fell into the water. That detail cuts both ways. While it matches the life preserver found on the shore, it is one more piece of his alibi that must now be weighed against what the forensic evidence actually shows. The family has quietly made one more move, too. They have handed over their own DNA to investigators. You do not volunteer your genetic code to let it collect dust. You offer it so if biological evidence is found, science can instantly identify it. If you have been tracking this mystery as closely as we have, you can feel the ground shifting under the entire case. Do us a quick favor and subscribe now so you do not miss the next development, because the twist that broke this case wide open is precisely where we are heading. Here is the revelation that changed everything. Brian Hooker carried electronic devices the night his wife vanished, and those gadgets silently recorded his every movement. And United States officials close to the investigation now reveal that the GPS data recovered from those electronics flatly contradicts his original story. Let that reality sink in. The path he described, the exact coordinates where he claimed Lynette fell, the destination he pointed search teams toward, that was the narrative everyone trusted. But authorities now say it sent searchers hunting in completely the wrong section of the Sea of Abaco. The digital trail shows a device traveling out onto the water, pausing in the Sea of Abaco, and then heading back to the mainland.
This path provides a much tighter search zone than the vague coordinates Brian offered. And do you remember those hand-drawn maps Brian made?
That is where those sketches backfire. When a prime suspect aggressively pushes his own narrative of events, he completely commits himself to it.
He locks it down. Yet it is that exact locked-down story that his cell phone now refutes.
A suspect can spin a tale with total confidence and still lie. But a phone tracking coordinates in your pocket has no idea it will someday testify against you.
It never gets nervous. It never forgets. It simply logs the truth and waits. And that damning discrepancy was not ignored. The Coast Guard is preparing to request permission from the Bahamas to deploy American divers into fresh sectors of the Sea of Abaco, areas completely ignored during the initial search because Brian's timeline pointed investigators elsewhere.
And because this critical search area lies within Bahamian territory.
Even with an American boat, this next step requires deep cooperation between two nations.
Consider what it takes to launch a new deep-water search weeks later in foreign territory, based solely on digital forensic data. Underwater recovery is slow, expensive, and incredibly hazardous.
You do not send specialized divers to search a new ocean floor on a mere hunch. You deploy them only when you are certain of the location. They are not revisiting the old coordinates. They are heading to a fresh spot dictated by data, not the husband. If divers recover what authorities are hunting for, this investigation pivots from a missing person search to a homicide inquiry. Suddenly, it becomes clear why federal agents impounded that vessel. Now, let us examine how they seized the vessel, because that operation is a story in itself. The Soulmate was not dragged away in chains.
The sailboat departed Marsh Harbor under its own sails, heading toward the United States, appearing to any observer like a boat simply returning home.
Lynette's daughter knew the ship was gone, but to anyone watching the horizon, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet 1 week earlier, the federal investigation had already narrowed in a way that foreshadowed this dramatic escalation. The Coast Guard Investigative Service had already published photos of another sailboat, one anchored directly beside the Soulmate when Lynette first vanished. They issued a public appeal, begging for any leads on the owner so they could question them. On its own, routine. But in context, it proved detectives were no longer looking for a lost swimmer. They were reconstructing a crime scene. Who else was on the water that night? Who could have witnessed the truth? You only hunt for outside observers when you doubt the husband's story. Then came the ambush. Roughly 40 nautical miles off Melbourne, Florida, the Coast Guard intercepted and boarded the Soulmate. The military terminology they used was intense. They described it as a highly complex surveillance and interdiction mission, coordinated by federal agents, Miami surface cutters, and specialized aircraft from Air Station Miami. Surveillance meant they were actively tracking them. Interdiction meant a physical, tactical takedown. Cutters, airplanes, and armed agents were all deployed to seize a single sailboat. That is a massive commitment, and the precise timing tells the real story. They refused to wait for the yacht to reach a private Florida dock to be scrubbed, sold, or hidden away. They struck in international waters, seizing it at the first legal opportunity to ensure the crime scene remained completely frozen, exactly as it departed the Bahamas. A yacht back in private hands is a vessel where evidence can vanish. A vessel seized mid-journey is a capsule frozen in time. For forensic teams desperate to analyze that hull, boarding it at sea was not a theatrical stunt. It was a calculated tactic. It guaranteed federal agents secured the evidence before anyone could compromise the scene. There is even a strange detail that makes it seem like the ship resisted its own capture. Right after the seizure, the Soulmate lost power and went dead in the water. The ship had to be towed by the Coast Guard cutter Winslow Greaser, which then transferred the tow to a rescue crew from Fort Pierce to drag it the rest of the way. So, the floating home this couple had sailed across an entire ocean met its end, not under sail or motor, but dragged by a federal tow line. Once at Fort Pierce, the scene changed instantly.
Yellow crime scene tape wrapped the hull as gloved forensic specialists worked the vessel for days.
Federal authorities confirmed the yacht was seized as part of an active homicide investigation, being processed for DNA. And all of this meticulous, highly structured protocol is not for show. It is designed to preserve the chain of custody.
For physical evidence to hold up in court, investigators must account for its exact journey, where it sat, who handled it, and how securely it was preserved.
From seizure to trial, every step matters. By seizing the soulmate at sea, towing it under strict control, and processing it by the book, they were safeguarding the evidence, not just collecting it. Every photo, every visitor log, and every sealed sample forms an unbreakable link in that chain of custody. When a case relies on physical proof, the defense attorney will always target how that evidence was handled first. This methodical care at Fort Pierce is essentially the sound of a heavy door slamming shut before anyone can pry it open. But the vessel did not stay there. They relocated it to Fort Lauderdale, a detail that sounds mundane, until you realize Fort Pierce simply could not lift the boat out of the water. To fully inspect a vessel, you must haul it out completely. A boat sitting in the harbor can only be searched from the waterline up. Once a boat is propped up on stands, forensic teams can examine every inch, from the deck down to the keel. They scan the hull, the bilge where liquids pool, the dark spaces beneath the floorboards, and the fittings passing through the bottom. Transferring the boat to a dry dock is the hallmark of an investigation determined to leave absolutely no stone unturned. Here is a detail that catches people off guard. You would think seizing a private citizen's home requires a warrant and piles of probable cause. But with an American-flagged vessel, it does not. Kenneth Engerand, a maritime law expert at the University of Houston, explained this legal reality very clearly. Since the soulmate flies the American flag, Coast Guard investigators did not need any search warrant. A precise federal statute grants them absolute authority over United States vessels and everything that occurs on board. The courts have consistently upheld this power with very few restrictions. They can conduct an entire search without ever facing a federal judge. Even when they target a specific suspect, the threshold is not probable cause. It is merely reasonable suspicion. This reality flips our standard assumptions upside down. The vessel seizure is not dramatic because they crossed some massive legal hurdle. It is chilling because they did not have to. The power was always theirs.
What shifted was the choice to act, escalating a search and rescue into a criminal probe, deploying federal resources, and seizing the boat as physical evidence.
Seizing a sailboat is expensive, challenging, and guaranteed to draw heavy scrutiny. Federal agencies weigh those costs carefully. The fact that they decided this boat was worth the effort tells us exactly how investigators now view this case. This same maritime expert raised a crucial point that should resonate with anyone who thinks a missing body means no homicide case. Even if Lynette is never located, criminal charges are still on the table. It is harder without a body, but certainly not impossible. Investigators are assembling the evidence alongside the U.S. Attorney in Florida, signaling that an American courtroom is already waiting. The disappearance occurred in Bahamian waters, which is why local Bahamian police launched the initial investigation. But the boat is American. Both hookers are American citizens, and by bringing the ship to Florida, the Coast Guard established clear federal jurisdiction over the case. Consider the massive institutional weight now lining up behind this. The Coast Guard Investigative Service is driving the probe. The FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, is processing forensic evidence. And a U.S. Attorney's Office is preparing to evaluate charges, while Bahamian police watch from their territory. This is not the footprint of a closed accident. It is the footprint of an open question that powerful agencies are determined to answer. So what secrets can they pry from a sailboat like this?
Far more than you would expect. A modern sailboat is no longer just wood and canvas. It is a floating computer wrapped in sensors, and its memory is absolute.
Take navigation. A vessel like the Soulmate runs on a digital chart plotter, the electronic brain logging exactly where it traveled, when, and how fast. It also carries an automatic identification system, the AIS, which constantly broadcasts the vessel's identity, precise coordinates, and speed to other ships and shore stations. For any sailor, the AIS is a vital safety tool designed to prevent catastrophic collisions at sea.
It is what keeps a massive cargo ship from crushing you in the dark. For a couple navigating open waters at night, it is almost never switched off.
To a detective, however, it is a silent witness that records everything without ever being asked. And that digital witness is precisely where the first crack in the story appeared, long before anyone inspected the vessel. Marine tracking data from Vessel Finder reveals the Soulmate's AIS went completely dark at 9:29 on the night of April 4th, the very evening Lynette disappeared, and remained silent until 8:40 the following morning. That is a blackout lasting over 11 hours, blanketing the exact window when Brian claims his wife fell overboard and he paddled to shore alone. The vessel that usually broadcasts its every movement fell silent during the most critical hours of the entire mystery. The transmission died at 9:29. Brian claims he spent the night struggling to reach land, arriving at the boatyard around 4 in the morning.
Yet that transponder remained mute until 20 to 9 the next morning, well after he reported her missing, and reportedly after search teams had already escorted him back out to the vessel.
This signal blackout covers the entire crucial window, and it was certainly not some isolated technical glitch. In fact, there were 3 other gaps between April 10th and 13th when the system fell silent. Our legal expert described the timing of these blackouts as highly suspicious. Of course, equipment fails and systems get turned off, but a boat that records everything going silent during those exact hours is not something any investigator would simply ignore. Then there is everything else on board, including any security cameras they had installed. Lots of live-aboard sailors set them up for security at anchor and to document their travels. Personal devices left in the cabin, the boat's power logs, the quiet digital ledgers that record exactly when systems drew current and when something was switched on or off. The days of sailing off the grid are over. Today's cruisers use satellite internet in the deep ocean, smartwatches tracking movement around the clock, and phones syncing to the cloud the moment a signal appears. A couple who built a massive following from their travels relied on exactly that kind of constant connection. None of this technology was installed to solve a crime, but all of it can be read by people trying to. And then we have the oldest evidence of all, the physical kind. A cabin and deck can be swept for blood, hair, and fibers, the tiny traces a person cannot fully scrub from a sealed fiberglass space, no matter how hard they try to erase them. Fiberglass and gel coat are non-porous compared to wood, but they are full of seams, hinges, and joints where microscopic evidence easily lodges and hides. Modern forensics can detect blood that has been diluted, wiped down, or washed away, revealing hidden patterns the naked eye cannot see. A vessel is a closed environment, and whatever happens inside usually stays right there. That is exactly why they wanted it hauled out, dried, lit, and gridded, and why the work started at sea continues deep inside the FBI lab in Quantico. We need to slow down and look at what that processing actually involves, because the images from Fort Pierce tell a chilling, quiet story of their own. Investigators were not just poking around for an afternoon. Photographed in gloves, they spent days methodically working the boat in a strict grid pattern. This is the painstaking surface-by-surface search a forensic team conducts in a room where someone was last seen alive. That deliberate tempo matters. A quick search takes an hour. What they did took days, followed by moving the entire vessel to a second city just to haul it out of the water and keep going. You do not invest that kind of time and energy into a vessel if you truly believe a passenger was just lost to a rogue wave. You do it because you suspect that boat is a crime scene, and this is where the family's DNA becomes incredibly powerful, since forensics relies entirely on comparison.
A mystery sample means absolutely nothing until you have a known profile to compare it against.
By gathering DNA from Lynette's family, investigators built a vital reference, a genetic blueprint to match against anything recovered from the sailboat, the dinghy, or the ocean itself.
If even a single speck of biological matter is found deep in a cabin seam, examiners can determine with absolute confidence whether it belongs to the missing woman.
Finding her DNA in a spot where it has no logical business being provides the kind of objective proof that does not rely on human memory or honesty. It is either there or it is not. The electronics follow that exact same logic, only their trail is digital.
When investigators seize a phone or smartwatch, they do not just scroll through messages. They extract a perfect bit-by-bit forensic image to meticulously rebuild its entire history.
We are talking location pings, app activity, exact timestamps, and even the files the owner believed were deleted.
A digital trail like that is incredibly difficult to fake after the fact, because it is constructed from dozens of independent data points that must all align perfectly.
So, when investigators state that the GPS data from Brian's device contradicts his timeline, that claim carries immense weight. It is not just one person's word against another. It is a man's story versus the objective, cross-checked memory of his own electronics.
Which brings us, at last, to the smallest physical object in this entire investigation, and perhaps the most crucial, the dinghy. And I mean the small dinghy, not the massive sailboat, because that is the detail so many people keep overlooking. Lynette did not fall from the soulmate at all. The yacht was anchored far out in the dark, completely empty, waiting for them to return. She went over the side of that 8-foot tender, out on the open water, with Brian right beside her. Everything he claims happened that night, the lost ignition key, the stalled engine, the grueling hours of paddling, comes down to that small tender and the outboard motor bolted to its transom. Which means, as strange as it sounds, the ultimate answer to Lynette Hooker's disappearance might not be found on the seized sailboat at all. It could be locked inside the memory of a single outboard engine. And a modern outboard motor is far from a simple machine. It is essentially a small computer attached to a propeller, carrying a control unit that logs exactly how the engine is run, just like your car's computer tracks its own diagnostics. It records throttle position, speed, RPM, and, most critical of all, the engine runtime, proving when the motor was running and for exactly how long. Many outboards track running hours and log a fault code the moment something goes wrong, like a sudden loss of power, an ignition break, or the exact shutdown a safety kill cord triggers. None of that diagnostic data was designed for an investigation. It simply exists to help a mechanic service the engine.
But it is logged faithfully, with timestamps, and it cannot be altered to fit a narrative. Now hold Brian's alibi up against what that motor actually recorded.
He claims the motor died the instant the safety key fell into the water with Lynette, leaving him stranded, paddling for hours in the pitch black.
The engine's internal memory speaks directly to that claim. When was it truly last running? Exactly when did it stop? Did that tender travel under motor power or by paddle? For how long and in which direction? If the motor ran and then cut out in one clean instant, that supports his story. But if it ran longer, stopped and restarted, or covered distance that manual paddling simply cannot explain, it points to a very different scenario. If the record and the story clash, both cannot be true. A man can recount that night with total conviction, but an engine has no stake in being believed. It only reports what happened. And the beauty of this raw data, if you can call it beauty, is its total indifference to human emotion. It does not care about a husband's tears, his heartbreaking posts, or the meticulous map he drew of where he claims his wife fell. A jury can be swayed by a grieving husband, or unsettled by one who seems too calm, but data moves no one, and it answers to no one. It either validates the timeline or shatters it entirely.
In a case where the only survivor's account has already collided with his own pocket GPS, a second independent machine record from the boat itself becomes virtually impossible to argue away.
That is why, amid all these moving pieces, the dinghy's engine data stands alone. Investigators can swab the cabin. They can extract the chart plotter, crack the phones, and dissect that 11-hour silence. Each piece matters, and together, they are incredibly powerful. But the motor on that small dinghy holds the raw facts, speaking directly to the most critical claim in this entire investigation. The assertion that the motor failed, leaving a husband to paddle back alone. Once detectives extract that data, the one piece of evidence that physically cannot lie falls into the hands of specialists trained to make it speak.
For 55 days, the only narrative in this mystery has belonged to the man who returned. This engine may well become the second voice.
In an investigation with no body and no eyewitnesses, that second voice could finally be the one that decides everything. Let me leave you with the very question that detectives are almost certainly asking themselves right now.
If the engine's log confirms his story, a key lost at sea, a failed motor, a grueling paddle home, then this remains a heartbreak, nothing more. But if that data contradicts him, then everything we thought we knew is completely wrong. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what that motor recorded on April 4th, and whether you think this fresh search will finally bring Lynette home. Does Brian Hooker's account hold water, or has the digital data already revealed the ending of this tragedy? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know your theories.
If you want more methodical, evidence-first breakdowns as this mystery unfolds, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. But there is one last detail before we go.
Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. He has firmly maintained his innocence and is fully entitled to the presumption of innocence.
The inconsistencies detailed here are based on claims by United States officials and major news outlets, none of which have been proven in court.
As of this recording, Lynette Hooker has not been located, and the active investigation remains ongoing. All information is sourced from Coast Guard statements and reporting by Fox News Digital, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, and NBC News.
And these details may change as new information comes to light.